All right, well, we're back now. We're going to pick up where we left off. I'm just wondering if there's any residual questions from what we covered so far. I know that there's a lot of interest in how do we get these kinds of services going, and I encourage people to consider whatever is going to work in your community. It's going to differ from one area to the next. It depends on political will. It depends on the will of the community. We talked about media, how we might be able to be more effective at getting media involved. And I think this is where you bring in some kind of celebrity, whether it be a sports hero or a local TV personality. If you can find somebody with a bit of notoriety, the kind of person that people want to get their autograph if they see them in public, that's the kind of person that you want to come along when you're trying to do some kind of promotional thing. And there are people out there. Noah Wiley is an actor who has been vocal about abuse towards men. There's a baseball player, I can't remember his name, but he was a victim of childhood physical abuse. Carlos Santana was a victim of child abuse. You've got Theo Fleury, you've got Sheldon Kennedy. There are people with a certain amount of notoriety who have enough of a history or that they care about these issues. And if you can get them to back you up, it's going to help further your cause and help bring some attention to what you're doing. So moving on, I want to go on to some general profile, common issues, and some effective interventions of what we're going to be talking about now. So there are a number of misconceptions. I may have alluded to them earlier, but I've been talking to so many people about these things over the last 2 days that I don't know if I'm repeating myself on camera or not, but what the heck. Better to say it twice than not at all. So one of the misconceptions is men are not sexually victimized. Well, that's certainly not true. There was a book by Matthew Mandel called The Male Survivor, and in that book he looked at all the research that had been done at the time, and they were looking at a number of factors. I think that at the level of child sexual abuse, we're going to have a 50-50 distribution of boy-girl victims. Now, in a small community, I did a lecture one time in Vanderhoof, BC, which I think is the population, 100 people or something. It's a very small community. There may be some incest going on, but aside from that, if there's a pedophile, if there's one pedophile in a small community, he or she may have a gender preference. In that case, then either boys or girl will be at greater risk because there's one perpetrator with a gender preference. But in a city of any size whatsoever, there are going to be multiple offenders. And some will prefer boys, some will prefer girls, some have no gender preference. Their interest is more within a certain age group. They're interested in the 3 to 5-year-olds or the 6 to 8-year-olds or the kids that are just going through puberty, whatever. So in a bigger city, child sexual assault programs are now showing an equal distribution of boy-girl victims. Now, when they first started out, let me back up a little bit. All of this started happening in the 60s when the women's movement started coming up with rape relief programs for women. What they were discovering is that a lot of the women coming into these programs, having been recently rape victims, also were disclosing a history of sexual abuse going back to childhood. So they began to realize that girls are being abused as well, not just adult women. So then they started setting up programs for female survivors of sexual abuse. For children. Excuse me, I'm getting distracted a little bit. That happens once in a while. So they started setting up children's sexual assault centers in some of the bigger cities, anticipating that their clients would be all girls. And they were at first, and that's because people were paying attention to girls. People weren't thinking about their boys. They didn't assume that their boys were in danger. I have a perfect example. I had 2 brothers I was working with. They lived in a farm in Quebec. And they were abused by an older kid than the neighboring farm. The older kid was like 19 years old or something, and these kids were like 6 and 8. And they used to hang out at the neighbor's farm because this guy would spend time with them. Their own dad says, I've got work to do, don't bother me, go find something else to do. So they would go to the neighboring farm where he would let them ride around on the tractor and that kind of thing. But he also sexually abused them. Well, one day, this offender was talking to a friend of his, and he used the word molest. And so one of these boys went back to Mom and said, Mom, what does the word molest mean? And she said, where did you hear that word? Well, so-and-so at the other farm said that word. So she asked both boys, did he ever do anything to you? No, sorry, I'm backing up. I jump ahead of myself sometimes. She asked her daughter whether this guy had ever touched her. And the daughter said no. She never thought to ask her sons. 10 years later, when the older boy was acting out, he got into the whole goth thing, you know, the black clothes and the white out face and the black lipstick and the black nail polish, that whole thing. He was getting into a lot of trouble, so the parents were sitting there like, what is going on for you? And that's when he disclosed that he had been abused by this other kid at the other farm. This was 10 years after the fact. She asked her daughter, way back when son brought home the word molest, but never thought to ask her sons. And that's not uncommon. When I was a kid growing up, my brother had a paper route, and he would go around collecting for the paper. In the wintertime, it would be dark at 6 o'clock or whatever, and he'd be going door to door collecting for the paper. My parents never thought anything of it. If my sister was going door to door collecting for a paper, they would have insisted that my brother or I or one of them would have gone with her. They never thought about the fact that my brother could equally be at risk. People used to think that only girls get sexually abused, boys don't. So nobody was paying attention to their sons, but now people are starting to pay attention. And so now, child sexual assault programs have equal number of boy-girl victims. And I figure that 25% of the male population have been victims of sexual abuse. Now in Vancouver, if I say that the population of Vancouver is 1 million, Greater Vancouver is bigger than that, but let's just say a million, half of that population are men. If 25% of the male population is victims of sexual abuse, that's like 125,000 if my math is right. We've worked with 12,000, that's 10% of the male victims that are out there. Where are the rest of them? For some reason, they still haven't gotten the message. I'm not really fully male because I've been victimized. Not too many men want to take that on. So I try to dispel that myth. Anybody can be sexually abused. A great big burly quarterback for the LA Rams, I think that's a team, drugged and raped. It can happen. So it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a victim of sexual abuse under certain circumstances. And certainly a child can do nothing to prevent themselves from being abused by a full-grown adult. Nothing. So it's not a failure on the part of the victim. It's a failure of society to not recognize the vulnerability of all people. Not just women, not just girls, but all people are potentially victims. Offenders are always male, not true. This book that I was referring to by Matthew Mendel, he was looking at all the research that was done at the time that he wrote his book, Male Survivor by Matthew Mendel. And some studies found only 6% female perpetrators being identified by their subject population. Some studies found as many as 60% female perpetrators being identified. So given such a wide disparity of findings, he was curious about that. So he looked at the research methodology. If the question was, have you ever been sexually abused? They were getting low numbers of men naming female perpetrators. But if the question was, what was your earliest sexual experience and who was it with? They were getting a much larger number of adolescent boys, you know, right around the age of puberty, in sexual situations with adult women. Now, the majority of the population are heterosexual. We believe that it's maybe 10%, probably higher if you, considering all the people that live closeted. Let's say that 15% of the population are homosexual. So that's only 15% of the boys out there. So all those 85% of the boys that are being sexually abused by a woman are going to see that as, oh, it's a woman, I'm supposed to like it, it's okay. But if they're abused by a male, then they recognize it as being wrong. And it's even more important for a heterosexual boy to name it as abuse, because they don't want anybody to think that they're probably gay, that they want to be part of this. Conversely, If a boy was abused by a woman and he's heterosexual, he's not going to want to name that as abuse, because what's your problem? That's a woman. She's pretty hot. Wish I'd had a go at her, nudge, nudge. So even I have heard cases of boys that have disclosed being sexually abused, recognizing it as abusive and something that was unwanted, but the reaction told them that their response was wrong. She's hot. What's your problem? Oh, yeah, right. It was okay. In fact, I saw a YouTube video one time about a man who starts out by, oh, abuse by women, oh, yuck, yuck. Isn't it? It's fun, it's great. But by the end of that very short video, he was nearly in tears. He said, I'm supposed to like it, right? So at the beginning of the video, he's talking about how society says he's supposed to welcome this experience. And so he's playing along with that, and he's in denial. But by the end of the video, he's starting to connect with the truth that this was upsetting and there's something wrong. I'm supposed to like it, right? I wish I could find the reference. I was co-presenting a couple of years ago, and my colleague had that video, and I've been meaning to track it down, but it's probably there somewhere on YouTube. They're all there. But the fact is that the distribution of sex offenders is pretty well 50-50. It's just that we don't look for female perpetrators. We don't believe that it can happen. And so it can be right there before our very eyes, and we don't see it. If you think about it, the majority of early childhood caregivers are women, either mothers staying home with the kids or daycares that are predominantly run by women. So here are a lot of women that have access to children. If they have a propensity to abuse, they can do so, especially mothers that are home alone with their kids all day. And I've had clients who that's exactly their experience. They're home alone with mom during the day, and they get abused. And no one knows about it because when anyone else is around, none of that shows. A couple other contributing factors. Before I established my agency in 1989, which was the first in the country, the only way that male survivors ever became visible is the low numbers that became sex offenders. The majority of sex offenders claim to have been victimized, and it's probably true. They're reenacting what has been done to them. They're passing on what they've learned. And so the only male survivors that we knew about were the ones that became sex offenders. So the assumption was male survivors all become sex offenders. Female survivors that were abused as a girl end up being adult sexual abuse victims as well. So there are a lot of misconceptions by the fact that the women's movement understandably focused on women who are survivors. And if most of those women were men, then men are bad, women girls, men perpetrators, women victims. That's only part of the picture. Now that there are some programs for men, not nearly as many as there needs to be, but there are some programs for men, we have a lot of non-offending male survivors coming forward and starting to deal with their issues. And I've heard so many men come in and say, I'm afraid to have children. I'm afraid I might abuse them. And I'll say, have you ever abused a child? Well, no. Do you have sexual fantasies about kids? No. Well, what's the problem? Why are you worried? Well, isn't it true that? And I'll say, no, it's not true. Probably less than 10% of victims actually go on to perpetrate. So if you're not having fantasies, if you're not looking at kiddie porn, if you're not fantasizing about abusing kids, you're probably not at risk. In fact, so many of my clients have said, when I think about what was done to me and how horrible that experience was, how could I possibly pass that on to some other kid? There's no way in the world I would ever abuse a child. That's the most common response from male survivors. Especially if they're really in touch with the trauma itself, then they're really aware of how committed they are to safeguarding the well-being of children. In fact, if you work with offenders, two things that you focus on is impulse control and dissociation. If a person is dissociated because they're flooded with their own trauma and they have no impulse control, then they're at risk for offending in some way, whether it be another adult or a child or whatever. So if you work with impulse control and disassociation with an offender, you start really addressing the underlying factors that contribute to the likelihood of offending. Survivors dissociate, and they may not have really good impulse control, but the more they're connected with their own trauma, the more they're able to identify how wrong it is to impose that very same thing on somebody else. So I'm not too worried about men working in daycares or being elementary school teachers or being coaches. Certainly perpetrators are drawn to those opportunities to have a whole bunch of kids that they can access. But generally speaking, men are as safe as women, or also as likely as women. So we really have to have a much more open attitude about how we look at these issues. Now, there's a video that was produced in Vancouver by Whiting and Associates, and it's called When Girls Do It. And the video is focusing on female sex offenders. And I'm interviewed in it. Several of our clients are interviewed. We had a simulated group setting where these guys only met that day, but the way they treated each other, the way they interacted, there was so much respect and mutual support. You'd swear these guys had known each other for months. All of them had been abused by women, and they came in and they shared their story. They focused on one of our clients when we had a Victoria office, who was basically a dumpster diver as a way of supporting himself. He'd be looking for bottles or cans or whatever he can cash in or something he might be able to sell. He was abused by a female social worker who was able to manipulate the system to get him away from her mother, single mother, but doing a pretty good job, all things considered, got custody of this child, moved him into her home, had sexual relationship, well, sexually abused him. It wasn't a sexual relationship, it was sexual abuse. She got pregnant by this 13-year-old. Her husband thought the child was his. It wasn't. We tried to lay charges against this woman, but it was prior to changes in the laws in the 1980s, which I'll touch on in a moment. But because of that, we could not charge her with sexual abuse, because the law used to say any man who blah, 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 so women could not be charged because the laws made reference to men. Now, in the 1980s, I don't remember the exact date, but they changed the law to be gender inclusive. So now it's anyone who touches a child or whatever. They also broke it down to more specific crimes like sexual touch or invitation to touch, which is basically groping, sexual exploitation, which is producing kiddie porn or prostituting a child, that kind of thing. Sexual assault, which is just sexual assault, aggravated sexual assault, which is using a weapon or some other kind of a threat to get the child to comply. And of course, those different offenses carry different consequences because of the severity, etc. But like I say, the real key change in the law was making it gender inclusive so that a woman could be equally charged. Now, this female social worker, the only thing they could charge her with, because the crime took place prior to the changes, was contributing to the delinquency of a minor. This was a social worker that was working with troubled kids. And because she couldn't be charged with sexual abuse, she was able to keep on working. Yes?
Made to penetrate, that's still not in the definitions, is it?
Pardon me?
Made to penetrate?
It might be in the description, but actually the law will maybe be more specific when you actually read the breakdown. But if a boy is forced to penetrate, that certainly still is a criminal offense. I've had adult males that were basically sexually assaulted by a partner. One man said, well, you know, we have to wear a condom, no penetration, blah, blah, blah. He was sort of a little bit out of it because they were doing drugs when they were having sex, which is not a good combination. But she pulled off the condom and mounted him, got pregnant, and now he's having to pay child support when he did not want any part of that. And he's been trying to fight that case. And I don't know whether he's been successful or not, but you know, genetic testing shows that it's his child and you got to be responsible, you got to support your kid. But he didn't want that to happen. And we've had a couple of similar kinds of descriptions where adult men were involved in some unwanted sexual situation. One man was completely passed out, but you know, men can have erections even when they're unconscious. And that's what happened. Somebody took advantage of the fact that he was aroused, that he was erect while being unconscious, again, got pregnant. And sometimes guys don't know how to say no. One of my clients said his son came home from a party and he was quite upset. And he said, well, what happened? And he said one of the girls there forced herself on him. He didn't know how to say no. He just thought that, I'm supposed to be saying yes? He was confused. He was overwhelmed by the experience. And so he was victimized. So it can happen. So we really have to have a much more broader view of these situations. Some people believe that men are not harmed by their experience, and that's because as men, we're socialized to suppress our pain, to suppress our fear, to suppress any semblance of vulnerability. We're supposed to be tough and in control at all times. You know, you step on a nail, it goes through your foot, you pull it out, you keep on going. You know, that's what men are expected to do. So men hide the harm. They hide the devastation. But if you look more carefully, why is that person drinking all the time? Why are they not going to work? Why are they angry all the time? Why are they sullen and distant? Well, there's something going on. There's something going on. I had a man one time, this was early on because I was still working out of my house in Victoria. A man says, you know, I've never hit a woman, but I've ground more than one man in the dust. And his anger was ramping up. And I was thinking, he's between me and the door. These windows don't open. I got to do something quick. So I said to him, you have every right to be angry because what happened to you shouldn't have happened. But I think there's a lot of pain there too. He said, yeah, you're right, and started crying. It was just that easy to validate the fact that we all have pain. We've all experienced trauma. I've had relatives die, my mother, father, sister, grandparents, and I'm not afraid of my grief. And I would a puddle of tears in front of me in the church. I'm not ashamed of that because I'm grieving. I'm lost something that's really important to me. But a lot of men can't allow themselves. When my uncle was killed in a car accident, my dad, who was his brother, was pasty white, would not shed a tear. The way we knew he was hurting is because he was kind of white in the face. He was much more silent. Usually he's very interactive. And he was like pulling on his neck all the time. And then several years later, we were playing a reel-to-reel tape. Yes, we had a reel-to-reel tape player way back in the day. And my uncle was on the tape. My dad said, turn that off, turn that off. He didn't want to hear it because to hear his brother on the tape meant that it was going to tap into that grief that he never allowed himself to have. Whereas my sister and I, who had no problem being in touch with our grief, we really liked hearing Uncle Dale on the tape. You know, it took us back to some really wonderful memories. It was kind of sad that he was no longer here, but there's a lot more joy in reminiscing than there was pain in the loss. But my dad could not allow that because he couldn't allow himself to have his grief. Why is it that men have high blood pressure? Why is it that men have ulcers? Why is it that men die of heart attacks? Because they do not deal with their emotional reality because society doesn't let them. So in my program, it's really important that we validate the importance of being in touch with your emotional life. And as a therapist, I have to be empathetically present. If I'm sitting there, oh, gang raped, and how many people was that? And how old were you? Oh, yes, and did you tell anyone? The message is that these are not emotional issues. It's just a bunch of facts. But when I hear a story, I can't help but respond. I'm not having an all-out boo-hoo, but a man told me this story one time, a horrible abuse story, but he was describing it like he was describing a walk to the corner grocery store. But this was early on in my career, and I had not heard a lot of these stories, and I was very moved by it. And there was a tear on my cheek, and he said to me afterwards, when I saw the tear on your cheek, it helped me realize that what I was telling you that was horrible, and it helped me get in touch with my pain. I'm not talking about, as a therapist, having an all-out boo-hoo with your clients. You know, I don't break down sobbing. But if they can't tell that I'm having an empathetic response, I'm like a parent who sees their kid getting hurt. We care about our children, don't we? And when our kids get hurt, we care, and we're upset. And we show that we're upset. I'm sorry, I'll take care of you. And so when we are empathetically present with our clients, we're validating the emotional reality of what they've experienced. And that is valuable. That's extremely valuable, especially working with men. And it helps men get in touch with their feelings. Men are harmed by these experiences, and we have to acknowledge that. We have to recognize that, and we have to provide opportunities for recovery. That's why there's so many men in alcohol and drug treatment programs. That's why the prisons are full of men. That's why 75% of the suicides are men, because nobody is giving them a space in which they can deal with their pain. We have to do that. We have to. I have to gather myself, though, because these things are important to me. Male survivors become offenders. Already said that a very low number of them become offenders. Abuse by the same gender causes the victim to become a homosexual. That's not true. There's nothing in the research that suggests that being sexually abused causes anyone to be gay, straight, bisexual, asexual, into inanimate objects, whatever. It does not cause someone to have a particular sexual orientation. But what it will do is cause confusion. Because if you identify as heterosexual and you're abused by an older woman and you're feeling grossed out by it, oh, what's my problem? There's a woman, I'm supposed to like it. If you're abused by a male and had an arousal response, first of all, the offender will use that. Oh, you wanted this, you like this. And if you tell anyone, people are going to know you're gay. And so the kid keeps silent because he's afraid, well, gee, maybe I am. It's not that you're attracted to man. It's not that you want that to happen. It's biological functionality. If I touch you with a lit cigarette, it's going to burn. It doesn't matter whether you want it to burn or not. It's going to burn. So when someone is stimulating your genitals, nerve endings send a signal to the brain sends a signal back, and you have an arousal response. It's biology, folks. It's not desire. So sexual abuse does not cause anyone to suddenly change their sexual orientation. But it will confuse them. And a lot of my clients don't know where they are. They don't know if they're into women, into men, whatever. Some will actually experiment with both genders as an attempt to find out. I don't think that you really need to do that. What you really can do, we want to get the baggage out of the way, first of all, separate the abuse reactive behaviors from your natural responsiveness. And then when you go out into the world and you see men, women, who are you attracted to? Who draws your attention? Who kind of causes your heartbeat to flutter a little bit? Then you start identifying where your responses are coming from. A lot of my clients are really confused, and I say, throw out the labels. Let's just not even think about that right now. Let's address the trauma. Let's reduce the effects of the trauma. Then we can start identifying what your natural responses are all about. It's rather disconcerting at first to not have some kind of label that you can cling to, but it's the only way that you can get to some kind of personal truth. So again, all the misconceptions are all there on the screen. None of those are true. So one of the things that we really try to do is invalidate those misconceptions and teach people about the truth. So if that's on the screen, misconceptions, it's not true. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is motivation for treatment. It's hard for men to get into therapy. It's hard for them to admit that they have a problem at all. So substance abuse recovery, the majority of people in an alcohol and drug treatment program, if given the freedom to do so, will disclose that they have some kind of childhood trauma. Quite often sexual abuse, but could also physical abuse as well, or both. I've had clients who are both physically and sexually abused during their childhood, and it's a pretty complex mess that they're having to deal with. So substance abuse recovery, when the substances that you've used to deaden your sensations, to deaden your memories, to deaden your feelings, when those substances no longer are blocking all that stuff, then all your trauma begins to float to the surface. And there's a lot of recidivism because people don't know how to deal with their trauma. So they go back to the thing that they do know, get stoned, get drunk, sexually act out, anything that will distract me from my trauma. So sexual addiction is certainly a very common issue for survivors, both men and women. Sometimes they'll masturbate 6 or 8 times a day because the feelings keep coming up and they keep wanting to push them down. So substance abuse recovery, like I say, the majority of people in those programs will disclose having some kind of historical trauma. Suicidal ideation, obviously there's something wrong when someone attempts suicide, so they very often get channeled into therapy at that point. Sometimes people assume that it's, especially for a man, that it's about something else. Maybe career failure or, a psychiatrist say it's a biochemical imbalance. That's all it is. But when I hear that, I come up with my own, okay, your partner left you, Your car broke down, you lost your job, you got evicted. Guess what? You're depressed and anxious. So a psychiatrist say, oh, depression, anxiety, I'll write you a prescription. So you're not as depressed and not as anxious, but your partner's still gone, you still don't have a car, you still don't have a job, you still don't have a place to live. None of those issues have been addressed. You may not be affected as deeply by it, but nothing has changed. So it's really important that, can that relationship be resolved? If not, then you have to get closure and move on. You have to do something about your transportation issue. You have to figure out where you're going to live. You have to figure out how you're going to support yourself so you can live. Those issues have to be addressed. And no chemical combination is ever going to resolve any of those issues. It's only working through them. Now, I used to be very anti-medication. I figure it was just expediency. It was a choice by people that were in a big hurry to get back to the golf course. They're really not interested in getting involved with helping people solve their lives. But now I realize that if someone is so deeply depressed that suicide is the only thing they can think about, we can't do the work. Because to face the trauma, it's going to be so overwhelming that they won't be able to handle it. Or if the anxiety is through the roof, that anxiety has to be brought down to a manageable level. The depression has to be lifted, not eradicated, but lifted to the point where they can look at what the source of that depression is. Now, we talk about an optimum range of emotional reality. Healthy human beings, their emotional ups and downs stay within this optimum range. People that have suffered trauma go well beyond this optimum range. Their highs are manically high and their depressions are deeply depressed. But what we try to do is to get people to moderate their emotional life so they can stay within that manageable range of emotional reality. And sometimes medication will help people stay within that optimum range while we address the life issues that need to be resolved. So to me, medication is a short-term intervention to allow the person to look at their life and to confront those issues and work towards resolution. Once resolved, then you taper off and discontinue the medication. But psychiatrists, I think, get a commission from drug pharmaceutical companies. They would like to see us all on medication for the rest of our lives. Now they're talking about antidepressants for your pets. I'm not going to be feeding antidepressants to my budgie. I'm going to get him a bigger cage. Or let him fly around the living room or something. I don't know, whatever. But, you know, a medicated life is not a life to live because it minimizes your connection with your life, both the bad stuff and the good stuff. I've had so many clients that just so flat affect. One client said, it feels like I've got a brick sitting on my head. No ups, no downs, just flat. Well, that's not healthy. That's no kind of a life to live. Like I say, temporary moderate medication while you solve your life dilemmas is the best workable solution. Now, there are people that don't need to be medicated because they're not so up and down, and they have enough, I don't know, ego strength that they can look at their trauma and not be undone by it. But some people do need that extra help of mild medication while they do the work that they need to do. So intrusive memories and flashbacks, sometimes this is what brings people in. I thought my childhood was great, and then I started getting all these flashbacks. I saw something on TV and I just suddenly had all these flashbacks. Or I had a family reunion and my cousin said, you remember that summer when so-and-so did the weird stuff in the barn with us? And, oh my God, you're right. I completely forgot about that. I'll bet any one of you, if you talk to relatives about something that happened way back in your childhood, someone's going to tell you a story you forgot about. But as soon as they tell you, you say, oh yeah, that's right, and you'll start adding the details because now the memory is there. We cannot remember every single moment of our lives. We're not, you know, a computer with endless megabytes of memory. So what we do is we kind of forget about the things that don't seem to be relevant or the things that are maybe kind of too much to deal with. So people get really good at suppressing their memories because that's the only way they know how to deal with them. And if they can't suppress them just by distracting their thinking, like focusing on something else, then they turn to the addictions that I've already talked about. But sometimes they can't hold back the memories. The flashbacks are there, and they realize they've got to do something about it. And then if there's a service available for them, they will reach out to that service. And what sometimes stimulates the flashbacks are unexpected triggers: a scent, a smell, a sound, a piece of music. Let's say that your offender wore a certain cologne, and somebody walks by you wearing that same cologne, and suddenly it's like you're thrown right back into your memory. And that's why in the profession, we are encouraged not to wear any kind of a scent, partly because people may have allergic reaction, but also because it could be triggering. And if you're not a trauma therapist, you don't want your clients triggering when you're trying to do employment counseling. We used to have a massage therapist across the hall from us before we moved to our current location. And he was saying that sometimes I'm doing some deep tissue work and the client will break down crying. Well, what's happening there? They've tapped into a body memory that's held in a muscle somewhere. And by getting at that, working that muscle, it's releasing the body memory that's being held there. And the client breaks down and has an emotional response. Well, massage therapists are not trained trauma therapists, so he said, obviously something's been unlocked there that you've held in your body. So I really encourage you, if it was a male, go across the hall and talk to the male survivors there. Or if it's a woman, here's some organizations that you can go and talk to. So very often, there's these unexpected triggers. I remember walking along one time, and I smelled something that took me back to my grandparents' farm. Fortunately for me, it was a happy memory, but just a smell. I like Lapsang Souchang is a kind of tea that has a smoky flavor. Whenever I brew this tea, I think about my grandfather because he always kind of smelled like smoke. First thing he did in the morning was fire up the wood stove where my grandmother would cook, and another little furnace that was wood powered. So he would be kind of all smoky, and he also smoked, so he'd go outside and have a cigarette. And he was a great guy. I really loved my grandfather. He was a good guy. So that smoky smell of this tea always takes me back to my grandfather and being on the ranch in the summertime. So sometimes these triggers are happy memories, but for survivors, very often they're not. A piece of music. Maybe while you're being abused, the offender had some music playing. So when you hear that same piece of music, decades later, suddenly you're thrown right back into the trauma. So a lot of times men are triggered, and that's what brings them into therapy. Sometimes the relationship is breaking down. The man is depressed, sullen, uncooperative, touchy, sensitive. The wife is saying, I'm so fed up with your behavior. If you don't smarten up and do something, this relationship is over. I don't know what's going on for you, but you need to get some help. I'm not putting up with this anymore. So then he goes and gets some help. Now, if he's aware of and willing to address his childhood trauma, then that's great. He comes to us directly. But he might go to a family therapist that starts out here on the surface somewhere. How are things at work? You know, are you satisfied with your career? Are you and your wife communicating well about are you on the same page when it comes to parenting? They explore a lot of those things. And finally, the disclosure comes that he was victimized and he's having these memories that are haunting him. So then if the therapist or psychiatrist is not prepared to deal with that, they'll refer him to a program that specializes in male survivor trauma. Life is in disarray. There can be a number of things. Being put on suspension from work because you're not present, you're sort of daydreaming, maybe you're having conflict with your coworkers, or you're really recalcitrant, the supervisor's trying to get you to do your job and you're being rebellious. There's all kinds of ways in which a person's life can be disarray. Financial problems are a real big issue. I've got clients where gambling might be addiction. So anytime that they get any money, they're heading to the casino or buying scratch and lose. Not scratch and win, scratch and lose, because that's more likely what's going to happen. And then how do you pay your rent? And then you go to cash money, where they charge a humongous amount of interest. Those places should be shut down. I think they're criminal, if you ask me. But one of my clients, his life has been ruined financially because he would gamble any money he did have, and then when he needed to pay the rent or something, he would go to cash money, and then he'd charge something like, I'm only exaggerating by about 2%, like 900% interest or something ridiculous. So you end up owing more money than you're ever going to be able to pay back. If you can keep up with the interest payments, that's about all you can manage. So he had thousands and thousands of dollars worth of debt. So he went to one of these financial advisors group, and the paycheck goes to them, they distribute, they pay his bills, then here you've got this much left over. And so now he's gradually paying, and he's been banned from the cash money, or money mark, those kind of places. He can no longer go there, which is not, cash money is not happy about that because they're making a lot off of him. But not anymore, and that debt is gradually coming down, but he still doesn't know how to manage money. He gets, $5, go in and buy scratch and lose. And even if he wins, he takes his $2 winning and buys more scratch and lose tickets, which of course he's going to lose. So he stays there until the money's gone, and then he goes home. So gambling is a serious addiction for a lot of clients, but it's that adrenaline rush. Well, I might win. That keeps people distracted from their inner turmoil that's going on, really. There's a lot of reasons why why a person's life can be in disarray. Yeah.
I want to address the issue of memories. There's a lot of evidence indicating that memories are quite unreliable. How do you deal with that?
Well, they're unreliable because they're not picture perfect. They're sketchy. And what a responsible therapist would be very careful working around memory. There are memory retrieval techniques, including hypnosis, but we just stay away from that altogether. We only work with what clients bring in. If during intakes, I'll ask clients, clients identify as survivors by calling in. We're a program for survivors. So when we do the intake, I'll ask, who were you abused by? And it doesn't happen often, but sometimes I'll have a client saying, well, I don't know, because I don't remember who it was. And I'll say, well, what leads you to believe you've been abused? Well, when it comes to any kind of sexual intimacy, I just want to run out of the room. Or I've got so much shame and guilt around sexuality. So I don't say, oh, well, that means you were abused, because how do I know? I wasn't there. But I will say to them, I'll explore some other things, like, what was the attitude in your household about sexuality? Could you ask your parents questions if you had any? Oh, no, we don't even talk about sex in my family. So maybe what they've experienced is not sexual abuse in the traditional sense of the word, but what I refer to as sexuality abuse. Sexuality abuse incorporates a lot more covert kinds of experiences. If I say to a 16-year-old girl, maybe if you wear makeup, you're so flat-chested, people are going to think you're a boy. Sexuality abuse. If I say to a boy, your voice is so high, you sound like a girl. Sexuality abuse. Or back in the hippie days when boys had long hair. Oh, excuse me, miss, even though you know it's a boy. Well, if you didn't have such long hair, I wouldn't think you're a girl. That kind of nonsense. Homophobia in all of its forms, sexuality abuse. If you're denied a job, denied an apartment, ridiculed in the streets, threatened, harassed because of your sexual orientation, those are all examples of sexuality abuse. It doesn't fit the traditional description of sexual abuse, but it still has a very similar kind of effect. So sexuality abuse is anything that either undermines your sense of gender identity or your sense of sexual safety. Another example, if you're at the change room at the public pool, you're in the shower and somebody's leering at you. They're not saying anything, they're not touching you, but you know what's going through their mind. You're not going there to get leered at. Well, maybe some people do, but typically you're not going to the pool to get leered at. Yet it feels really uncomfortable to have some person kind of looking at you with that kind of hungry look in their eyes. That's very disconcerting, and it makes you, I don't think I want to go back there. I think I'll just go home in my sweaty clothes and shower when I get home. Some people do that because they don't want to be leered at when they go into the change room. So sometimes people have not had a sexual abuse experience, but they've had some kind of sexuality abuse experience. So by asking some questions, what was your attitude in the household about sexuality? Could you ask questions if you were curious? Oh, no. Did your parents ever explain what sex is all about? Oh, no, we never talk about that. Have you had sex education in schools? Oh, no. Some people are brought up in a really rigid religious environment where sex is taboo. It's only for procreation, and it's only in marriage. You're not supposed to enjoy it. You're supposed to just lie there and wait till it's over and then get pregnant, maybe. So if people actually if they have some sexual feelings that feel kind of nice, their religious upbringing teaches them that they're some kind of a pervert. Being raised Catholic, you had to go to confession and confess everything. Lying, shoplifting, cheating on your homework, masturbating, whatever. And the response is, well, if you don't stop, you're going to burn in hell for all eternity, along with Charlie Manson and Adolf Hitler. So how could a young boy or a young girl who's having their awakening sexual feelings, if they're told by the church that they're some kind of a pervert because they have sexual feelings, how can they feel good about that? That's a form of sexuality abuse. Instead of saying you're going to burn in hell for all eternity, the priest should say, we all have these impulses, we have to learn to control them. We can't let our impulses control us, we have to control them. Sex is something that you share with someone that you're in a committed relationship with because you want to create a family together. No, that's not the only reason, folks. We know that. You don't have to be married. You don't have to be enjoying sex for the sole purpose of creating children, but there has to be some kind of relationship dynamic. You have to be old enough to know what you're doing. Informed consent is the operative word. You have to know what you're getting involved in before you can accurately consent to it. Children can't do that. Young adolescents can't do that. They cannot give informed consent because there's a lot they don't know about their own bodies, let alone the complexity of sexual relationships. So a priest should provide, or a religious person should provide more guidance around making conscious choices about when and with whom you enjoy your sexuality. And then it's an act of giving pleasure to someone that you care about and graciously receiving the pleasure that they give you. It's not about distracting yourself from your black feelings. It's not about using people. It's not about having your needs met regardless of the person who you're using to have your needs met. So there's a lot of opportunities for really some healthy education around sexuality. But instead, a lot of fundamentalist religions, like the really hardcore dogma religions, their reaction is shame and guilt. And that's not healthy. So people end up having a lot of problems around sexuality. And then if they don't identify that that was the root of it, they think, well, I must have been abused by somebody. And so I'm not going to say, well, yeah, you probably have been. I'm just going to, if anything, I might explore the issues, your depression, your anxiety, your fear of intimacy. What are those things all about? And then eventually, I think the memories will start coming up because the psyche knows when it's time. The psyche knows when you're ready. The psyche knows when you're finally in a safe place where those things can come out. And then, you know, it happens so often, you can almost count on it, that clients come in with one or two sketchy memories. And like I say, you only work with the information you're given. And you help them understand that the shame is not theirs, it belongs to the person that did that to you. Your addiction is a way of managing your feelings, whatever you do. But then what happens? The memories start coming to the surface because now is the time. And I'm starting to deal with it, and I've got this whole mechanism that kept it locked away, and now it's time to unlock that and let it all come out. So, yeah, there are such things as false memory. But false memory syndrome is an excuse used by offenders that don't want to get caught. There was a false memory syndrome movement, and one of the key people was actually a survivor of sexual abuse that was in denial. And a lot of the people involved in that were also perpetrators that were using false syndrome as a way of justifying themselves. Now, we know that kids are susceptible. If I say to a kid, do you have an elephant in your backyard? They suddenly have an image of an elephant in their backyard, and they say, yeah. So police officers and social workers are trained to interact with children where they can get information without leading the child to any kind of conclusion. You don't say, let's say that the parents are separated and you have, father has visitation rights. You don't say, well, when you go to visit your father on the weekend, does he put his hand down your pants? No, of course you're not going to say that. What you're going to say is, so, like, what do you do when you go to stay at your dad's place? Oh, we watch TV. Well, what else do you do? Oh, and then you get a description. Sometimes we go to the park. Okay. Well, what do you have for dinner? Oh, well, sometimes you make hot dogs, and sometimes we have pizza. Sometimes, But you don't say, does he ever do this to you? And in fact, I worked with I've had a small number of offenders that I worked with in private practice. And I worked with this one man that he had been abused by a babysitter when he was six years old. He had a daughter and a stepson. And when the kids were in the bathroom, and he's doing what parents do, you give them a bath or you put them on the toilet or whatever you do with them. Because of the association with that situation, he would start having an arousal response. He also said to me at one point that the only people that were ever affectionate with him were sex partners, and that includes offenders and people that he chose to be sexual with within his own peer range as a young adult, late teenage, early 20s. And I met his mother, father, and one of his sisters, and yes, they all of them were very egocentric, not very emotionally giving people. So I believe him when he says he grew up in an emotionally cold household where nobody hugged anybody. So the only people that hugged him were sex partners, offenders, and chosen partners later on. So when his kids were affectionate towards him, that association was so strong that he'd have an arousal response. And he's in the bathroom. And sometimes parents will shower with their children, with their toddlers, because it's easier to just get in the shower with them and give them a bath, or give them a shower, whatever. So he would be with these kids, and he'd have an arousal response, and then one of the things he would do is put his penis between their legs. But he would catch himself right away and says, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry, that wasn't right. That wasn't right for me to do that. It happened maybe 5 or 6 times altogether, and he moved out because he knew he had a problem. When he came to me, he disclosed being a victim of sexual abuse, and we could have stopped right there. But he said, that's not the only thing I want to deal with. And I said, okay, well, what else? And he said, I abused my daughter and stepson. And I said, how recent was that? And he said, well, not that long ago, but I knew I had a problem, and so I moved out. And he said, I'm a worthless human being. I don't have a right to live. And I said, I don't agree. You didn't have to tell me that. We could have just stopped at you being a victim. But you didn't. You chose to tell me about that. And you moved out because you knew it was wrong. And for that reason, you have my support. But because it's current, there's a duty on my part to report that, because the potential for you spending time with your kids and slipping up is still there. So I have to report this unless you're prepared to report yourself. And he said, well, I would report myself, but the concept really frightens me and I don't know how to go about it. And I said, well, I'll help you with that. If you're serious, we can do that. And so I said, we don't have to do that today. When you come in next week, we'll make the phone call. He came back. He didn't have to. He came back. So I made the call, and I said, I've got a client that wants to disclose that he's acted out sexually against his kids. So they said, okay. Now, this was in Victoria. So we went out to the Saanich police station, and they sent a constable over from Victoria, or from Vancouver. That's where it took place. So here we were sitting in the foyer of the police station, and this helicopter's landing in the back. It's like the black ops have arrived. This guy's stress level was so high that if he was holding a light bulb, it would have lit up. It was so electric. They wouldn't let me sit in on the interview, but they took him in and they took a statement from him. And afterwards, we talked a little bit, but he was so stressed out. I had to get back to my office, and he had to get to something else, to work or something, I guess. But I supported him through that whole process. I went to the trial when he was put on trial. His lawyer said, I can get you off these charges because the children's testimonies are not valid. Clearly, they had been coached. And he was right. He could have thrown the case out because of the invalid testimony of these children, the only real witnesses. But my client said, I don't want to plead not guilty because I don't want my kids to think that somehow it was their fault or that nothing happened. I need to be responsible. So the lawyer said, that's clear, if that's what you want to do. So he pled guilty. He was sentenced to either 15 or 18 months. I can't remember now because it was many years ago. So he was found guilty, convicted, sentenced to a camp for sex offenders, which the BC government, in their wisdom, shut down. It was a really good camp because it was all sex offenders where guys could be honest about why they're there. So all these guys were moved into other prisons, into general population, where if you're what they call a skinner, you are the target of everyone's hostility because most of the guys in there have been victims of sexual abuse. So perpetrators do not do well in prison. If they survive at all, they've suffered a whole lot of beatings. Most of them end up getting killed in prison. So all these sex offenders that were moved into general population, oh, I'm in here for a drug offense, I was trafficking drugs, or I was doing B&Es. They do not talk about what they're in there for and how is that healthy. It's not. Well, the camp had a treatment program. They were treating offenders. But, money issues, they shut it down. Anyway, so I visited him the whole time that he was in the camp. I'd go up every 4 weeks or something just to keep that connection. When he was released, not only did he see me for the 2 years that he was on probation, but when that ran out and he was no longer under the eye of the government, he continued to come in and see me for another 2 or 3 years. And even now, once he doesn't live in Vancouver, he lives on Bowen Island. Quite often when he's in town, he'll call me up and say, do you have time for coffee? Because he needs to have that connection. And we kind of update on what's going on in life. He was smoking too much dope, and he and a girlfriend were drinking too much. So I kind of encouraged him to curtail the drinking. He stopped smoking marijuana, and he's cutting back. I don't know if he stopped the drinking, but I think he's cut back, and I think he's distanced himself from an unhealthy relationship. So we still have that connection. And I think that this guy, because we've resolved the trauma that led him to abuse, I don't really think he should, but I think if he worked in a daycare, the kids would be safe. I really do. Because he's not really a pedophile. He's reenacting the unresolved trauma. That's what it was all about. And quite often, that's what offenders are doing. Subconsciously, they recreate the dynamic in which they were abused. But of course, this time around, they're playing the role of the offender, because if they can sort of see it from that perspective, maybe they'll get some insight into how could this have happened in the first place. But unfortunately, it's kind of a subconscious process, or partially subconscious. So it's not really effective, because that's not the best way to resolve your trauma and understand what you went through. But that's what some people do. So, yeah, I'm not really too concerned about false memory. Because if someone's going to create a story about their childhood, why would they create an ugly one? It's more likely that people, I think the biggest false memory is, oh, I had a great childhood. I had loving, nurturing parents. I was never abused. Well, why is it that you're strung out on drugs? Why is it that you haven't had a healthy relationship ever? Oh, well, I just like being, some other kind of bullshit story. But they've told themselves that they had a great childhood because the truth is too overwhelming. So false memory can go both ways. It can hide the trauma, or it can create a trauma where there isn't one. So what I do is I just work with what people present. I think this is a really good example. I mean, in a way it's kind of extreme, but I think it illustrates the point. I had a client that came in, he said, I have trouble sleeping at night because people are walking through the walls of my apartment and messing with my brain. Well, clearly that's a psychotic delusion. Well, I can't say people can't walk through walls except in a Star Trek movie. That's not real. Because he would just discount me. Oh, you're just somebody else that doesn't believe me. That would be the last I ever saw of him. But I couldn't collude in his delusion because that's not healthy either. What I said instead is, what's that like for you to lie there at night worrying about that? Because it doesn't matter whether it's possible or not. The reality is he's lying there at night believing it to be true, and therefore can't sleep. That's true. So that's what I focus my work on. What's it like for you to lie there at night? And I've had a number of clients that have a lot of sleep issues. And with a different client who was having trouble sleeping at night, I asked him where the abuse took place. He said, well, in my room at night, the offender would come in and abuse me. I said, well, there's probably a connection there. You don't feel safe in your bed because you have such a strong connection with the fact that you're abused in your bed. He said, well, I guess. I said, when you go home tonight, before you go to bed, go around, check every single window, check every door, double check to make sure that everything is locked up and secure and that you're safe and that no one can get into your apartment. So he said, yeah, okay. So he went home. He came back the next session. He said, I did that. I had the best sleep I've had in years. Because he had such a pervasive sense of unsafe in his bedroom. But by really going through and really showing himself that he's completely secure, then he was able to relax and go to sleep. So I've done that a couple times with clients who are having sleep problems, to really reify the fact that they are safe in their environment, that nobody can have access to them. So, yeah, it's not difficult for a therapist to work with somebody without getting mucky with their memories. What I don't want to do is leave the clients with any doubt that what they remember is true. So even though I know some ways to sort of help unlock memories, I don't. We work with what the clients remember, and as you work with that, other things start to come to the surface. You don't have to probe for the memories. The memories will find the client. The client doesn't have to find the memories. Any other questions?
Yeah, actually, I have one. What's your opinion on children who are survivors of sexual abuse and that it causes early sexual activity?
It can.
Yeah.
It's early because children are naturally curious. All three of my degrees were geared towards working with gifted children. And that's what I was going to do. Interviewer asked me once how I ended up doing this, and I was telling my story, and I got to this point, and I said, I was planning on working with gifted children. I thought, I am working with gifted children, but they're adults now, and they're burdened with trauma, so they've never really accessed all their gifts, all their potential. But when a child is, because I studied developmental psychology, around, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6, kids start picking up on the fact that boys and girls are different. And they get into the curiosity thing, playing doctor or whatever you want to call it. Kids will start looking, well, how do you pee if you don't have one of these? Or whatever. Or boys will say, when around puberty, well, when you rub yourself, does white stuff come out? Because they don't know. They don't know. They have no information. So where a child has been introduced to sexual activity by an adult, sometimes it feels good. Let's face it. And there's an organization, the acronym is NAMBLA, North American Man-Boy Love Association. A bunch of pedophiles that try to justify their behavior by saying, children are sexual and they have a right to experience their own sexuality. Yeah, with each other, not with an adult. And kids will. Well, kids are curious about how do you go to the bathroom? Like, what does yours look like? Does it feel good when you touch yourself? I mean, nobody's teaching them these things, so they learn from each other. So once they figure that, okay, boys and girls are different, okay, I got it. They lose interest. And they enter what the developmental psychologists call the latency period. And that goes from about 5 or 6 to puberty. And they have no interest in sex or sexuality, and typically they will only hang out with their own gender. Boys are all doing what boys do, and girls are all getting together and doing what girls do, playing with dolls or whatever. But they don't really mingle all that much. Maybe siblings do within the household, but by and large, like at the school, the boys all hang out, the girls all hang out, because there's no interest. And then the hormones start kicking in, and puberty starts happening. And then the curiosity starts coming up. And then there's quite often more experimentation at that point. Like, do you get aroused? Does your penis go stiff sometimes? That kind of curiosity. And girls menstruating, if they haven't been told or warned by their mother about what's happening, they can be quite traumatized by all of a sudden they're bleeding and they don't know what's wrong. They think they've injured themselves in some way. So appropriate information that's appropriately timed, will help alleviate a lot of these curiosities and a lot of these sometimes experiences that can be somewhat traumatic if they don't know what's going on. So around, puberty, post-puberty, there's a lot of curiosity. Sometimes kids will experiment with their own gender, the opposite gender, whatever. It's not unusual. And then pretty soon they start orienting towards what's ultimately going to be their orientation. And then, maybe 16, they start having serious boyfriend-girlfriend things going on. And then, there you go on from there. But, so children that are sexualized too soon, they have been introduced to an activity that has some kind of effect on them. If it hasn't been traumatic, like scary traumatic, trauma is different because trauma can be just an unhealthy reaction to something. It's not actually always scary. Confusion can be traumatic. It's not frightening, it's just confusing. I don't know what's this all about. I don't get it. What's going on? I don't understand. That's traumatic. But if the assault has been scary, like some shut up, quit your crying, and you're held down and forcibly penetrated or whatever, that's really scary and disturbing and traumatic. But if it's a subtle manipulation, where, say, a parent who's caregiving, they spend a lot of time washing the genitals. They're not that dirty, folks. They're getting something out of it on a personal level. The kid doesn't realize that some kind of inappropriate behavior is going on because mom or dad are having an arousal response by bathing this kid and spending a lot more. One client talked about his grandmother bathing him when he was 12 years old. Well, grandma's getting something out of it. She's not yelling at him. She's not screaming at him. She's not frightening him. But she's spending way too much time washing his genitals when he's 12 years old and doesn't need someone to give him a bath. So, when you get say a 10 or 11-year-old kid sexually acting out with a younger kid, you can pretty well count on the fact that somebody's gotten to him or her. In fact, I had a client that was abused by his father and older brothers who probably were abused by father earlier. And so it was a big family, so he tried to act out with his younger siblings, a younger boy and girl. And they both said, no. And so he stopped and he never did it again because he picked up on the fact that they didn't want it and realized that, you don't cross that line. I mean, not that he gave it this kind of a label, but he didn't go where he clearly got the message that he was not welcome to go. And so he thought that he was a sex offender. I said, no, you're a kid acting out. You were simply doing what your father and older brothers had already normalized. And it didn't seem abnormal or out of line because the dad did it to me and my brothers did it to me. I guess I can do it to my brother and sister. It's what we do in this family, I guess. And so kids can be sexualized. And so if kids are engaging in sexual behavior that kind of seems out of line, like children, like I talked about that curiosity period. Well, yours doesn't look like mine. How does yours work? The concept of penetration doesn't enter their mind. They might touch externally, but the idea of any kind of penetration, a penis going into a vagina or a bum, is incomprehensible to a child who's merely curious about how our bodies are different. So if a child is attempting penetration, it's because they've been introduced to it by an offender. You have to leave open the possibility of some minute, small chance of an exception to that rule. But by and large, it's an alarm bell that makes you want to start paying attention to what's going on. Other questions? I just have a call. So these are a lot of the presenting problems that clients bring in. And I would say that to varying degrees, all of our clients experience all of these. For some, any one of these issues might be predominant and it might be a major issue that's really life-sabotaging. But they'll have varying degrees of all of them. Distrust. Typically, the offender is someone that the child knows. And in fact, the closer to the child, the more likely the offender is going to be someone. In sort of a pencil and paper analysis I did one time with my own clients, took about 20 intake forms and I sort of did a count. The most common offenders were fathers, followed by mothers, followed by stepfathers, followed by stepmothers, followed by other, like older siblings or other family members living with or close proximity to the family. I think I may have mentioned that, the alcoholic uncle that lived 600 miles away. The least common are strangers. And of course, coaches, teachers, priests, clergy, doctors, people like that, babysitters, a lot of babysitters in the mix. So when you've been violated by somebody whose job it is to look out for your well-being, if you can't trust that person, how can you trust strangers? So distrust is a major issue for a lot of survivors. And to some extent, they don't trust themselves because time and again, they end up in a bad situation. They're drawn to unhealthy environments because that's what they know how to relate to. And so the distrust can also be about the self. And I'll talk about that more when I get into more of the intervention, but distrust is a major issue for a lot of survivors. Issues of authority. When the offender is someone in a position of authority, whether it be a parent, a teacher, a priest, a babysitter, somebody who's got control over your life, when they have violated that authority role, then why would you trust any authority figure? If you can't trust the authority of mom or dad, how can I trust this supervisor at work who has no emotional connection to me? He doesn't care whether I live or die. He just wants me to do my job. How can I trust that person? So a lot of survivors have such issues with authority. They don't like being told what to do because they don't feel like they have control when they're being told what to do. And when they don't have control, they get hurt. So surrendering to the authority of anybody puts them in a very frightening situation. And it can be quite overwhelming. And so they end up being difficult, adversarial. I think this is kind of, in a way, kind of a funny example. When I worked in display for a while, my next door neighbor got me the job. She said, oh, you know, why don't you come work at display because they're looking for somebody. It would be fun. We can work together. I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And I had one of my degrees is a fine arts degree. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But when our supervisor came around to us, my friend would get into a fight. The supervisor is coming in, well, you know, why are you still here? I wanted you somewhere else. And my friend would say, get off my back. If you weren't always on me all the time, I'd have the job done. And they get into a big fight. My supervisor came to me and said, why are you still here? I wanted you to do the display in the bookstore. I said, oh, okay. Well, when I arrive in the morning, if you give me a list of your priorities, I'll make sure I do those first. Oh, okay, I can do that. So instead of yelling at her and saying, get off my back, you're always bugging me, I basically told her how she could do her job better, but she didn't realize that that's what I was doing. Give me a list of your priorities, and I'll respond to those accordingly. Oh, okay, I can do that. And so she did from then on. We didn't have a fight because I don't have an issue with authority. My neighbor had been sexually abused by her mother. Our supervisor was a woman. So, of course, she had issues with authority. Whereas I didn't have problems with authority, so I would just negotiate a better way to work together. So it's a big issue for a lot of people and why they have trouble holding down a job. Anger is a big issue, and especially for men. Not to say that women aren't angry, because women can be angry just like anybody else. But men are not allowed to be vulnerable. So what men do when they have vulnerable feelings, they cap it over with anger. Because if I've got fear, or I'm confused, or I don't know what to do, and I'm being expected to come up with a solution, it's overwhelming, instead of showing my vulnerability, I'll get angry. Because if I'm angry, I don't have to feel my vulnerability, and you don't see my vulnerability. All you see is my anger. And even a small person, if a small person is really angry, somebody's going to think twice about messing with them. No, I don't know if I want to go there. That guy's pretty angry. So anger acts as a defense mechanism to keep people from getting in your personal space where they will then pick up on your vulnerability. And you don't have to feel your vulnerability yourself because you're busy feeling angry. So anger is a really big issue. Now, some men have been taught that they cannot hit a woman. So they might be angry. Instead of taking it out on their wife, they will internalize it and they'll be angry with themselves. So anger is really, it's not the problem. The anger itself is not the problem, but how it's expressed. If, for example, someone lights up a cigarette in my office, let's say, if I say, you effing asshole, you take your goddamn cigarettes and get the hell out of my office, That's not going to work. They're just going to get angry and defensive. But I say, sorry, this is not a smoking environment. If you need a cigarette, we can take a break and you can go outside. And that's fine. There's a solution. I validated the fact that they need a cigarette. I've honored my boundary that you can't smoke in my office, and I've given them an alternative. So I've worked with clients who, they have every right to be angry, but the way they express it, the only response is the walls go up. But if you want people to hear what you're angry about, you say, I'm really angry with you. You made a promise to me, and you broke that promise, and I had to pay the consequences. And I'm not happy about that. So it really makes me think twice before I enter into kind of an agreement with you, because I don't know that I can trust you to honor the agreement. Well, the person can hear that. They might rationalize. They try to come up with excuses, but they're not just going to throw up their wall and get the hell out of the room. But if you come on with this really angry hostility, a defense mechanism is the only response you're going to get. So anger is a common feeling, and so our work with clients is all about validating the anger and learning a more functional way of expressing it. Depression is a very common feature for male survivors, well, any survivor, actually, but depression is really a product of the accumulation of all these other things they're feeling. I can't trust anyone. I can't deal with authority. I keep losing my job. I don't know what to do with my anger. If people stay out of my face because my anger puts them off. My life isn't working. Then they sink into the depression. And because they don't have that mood management, their depressions go deep, and then they get suicidal. And then takes us on to the next thing, addictions. And survivors learn early on how to deaden their feelings. They discover that a number of things will deaden the feelings. Kids will sneak into the alcohol, and they get that buzz, and they think, oh, that's kind of nice. That's better than the one I was feeling. So they get in the liquor cabinet. They pour out, a glass of vodka and pour in a glass of water, so hopefully Dad won't notice. Whoever, not me. I never did anything like that. Yeah. So, and then there's sexual addiction. Pleasuring oneself is a really good way to distract yourself from your internalized trauma. And, pun intended, it's always close at hand. Anyway, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, sex addiction, workaholism, obsessive working out, food addiction, TV addiction, internet addiction, computer games, pornography, anything that will completely capture, gambling is a big addiction, anything that will capture your attention so you don't have to think or feel about the trauma. And kids learn early on how to dissociate, how to, and they get into all kinds of addictive behaviors. PTSD or complex PTSD are a psychological diagnosis that applies to survivors of trauma. And a lot of clients have gone to psychiatrists because they're having a lot of these kinds of issues coming up. Psychiatrists will say, oh, you're borderline personality disorder or you're bipolar, which implies some kind of biochemical imbalance in the brain. So they give you a prescription which is supposed to balance out your biochemistry. They are not at all interested in your life. I mentioned earlier about the car breaking down, the relationship going sideways, getting evicted, losing your job. Those are real lifetime issues. And psychiatrists don't want to deal with the trauma in your life. PTSD, that classification, recognizes that there is a trauma that you're having an abreactive series of responses to. So by addressing the trauma, then you can resolve the impact of the trauma. Now, complex PTSD, as opposed to simple PTSD, usually it's when the abuse started earlier on. Let's say you're 14 years old, you grew up in a nurturing household where you're loved and respected, that the family has pretty good boundaries, that you were never abused, and then at 14 years old your coach abuses you. You've got this original paradigm. this healthy, nurturing paradigm where boundaries are expected, and you can juxtapose that to what the coach did, and oh, that doesn't fit. That feels out of line with my sense of reality. Oh, there's something wrong there. But when you've been abused, particularly in the home by parents, from infancy on, it's so normal. That's your world paradigm. That I'm something to be used by anybody that wants their needs gratified. Yeah. So complex PTSD is based on the age of onset, the duration, and sometimes the location. Certainly it's far more traumatic to be abused in your home because you live in your home. So every moment of your life that you're at home, you're living within the trigger. Even if the offender is not at home, let's say it's dad, let's say, and he's at work, you know that he's coming home. At some point he's coming home, and when he gets here, I'm going to be in danger. So simply being in the home is traumatic. Now, if you're abused down at the playground on the weekend by a stranger when you're hanging out with your friends, then you're not triggered because you kind of stay away from the playground on the weekend. You don't have to go there. Your friends can come over to your house, you go to their house. It's like, oh, the creepy guy's down there. I'm not going to the playground. Not a big deal. But when your home is the site of the aggression, and so many clients have trouble sleeping because they were abused in their beds at night. So not just the home, but the bed. So location, duration, the closer you're related to the victim or to the perpetrator, the more traumatic the experience and the younger you were when it happened. Complex PTSD can easily take 10 years or more to treat. I had that one client I mentioned, our RUP program that I've been seeing for 10 years. He was abused in the home and outside the home. No, that's 7 o'clock. Getting up is going to kill me. So he's got complex PTSD. I've had clients that were abused by coaches or teachers or something at 14 years old. And it's a lot easier to get to the root of the issues and to start making some progress with recovery. So PTSD, I would say maybe 18 months to 2 years. Complex PTSD can be 10 years or maybe even longer. It also depends on how long they live with the trauma. Because the longer you live with the trauma, the more solid footing that dysfunctional behaviors have. You spend a lifetime dissociating. You spend a lifetime being angry. You spend a lifetime in your addictions. Well, not a lifetime, but 30 or 40 years is pretty close. Then takes a lot more work to change those behavior patterns. Imagine if I ask you to stop speaking English and start speaking Swahili. Go ahead. Why aren't you speaking Swahili? But if I spent an hour teaching you Swahili and then next week I say, well, what do you remember? You'd probably remember some of it because it's current. But when you lived with abreactive behaviors associated with trauma for 40 years, that is your reality. It's so deeply implanted in your psyche that it takes a lot of work to root it out. And you don't just root it out, it has to be replaced by something healthy that serves the same purpose. And I had a client say at one point, I feel so empty. I just don't even know who I am anymore. I just feel like I'm just empty. And I said, imagine that you're a room. And that room has been filled with somebody else's garbage, but you and I have been working, and we've gotten rid of all that garbage. Now you've got this big empty room devoid of all that garbage. Now you can fill it up with the things that you want to fill it up. Art, music, designer furniture, a miniature golf green. It's your room to do with what you want. And so not long after that, he signed up for a pottery course at UBC and started doing pottery, which is great. So sometimes the client's identity is so tied up in the trauma that when you remove the trauma, they really feel lost. But that's why while you remove a dysfunctional coping strategy, you try to make sure that they've got something good to replace it with. So I might encourage my clients to take yoga, or to get into running, or go for day hikes or bike rides, or take up art or study music. Something that in itself is healthy. And that's how you begin to to break down the PTSD. Guilt and shame is the last thing on this particular list. There's another list. There's still more coming. But guilt and shame is a big issue. A lot of survivors feel a lot of guilt and shame. Now, part of that's because kids and dogs are really perceptive. They read people real well. And so when offender feels some kind of guilt, because let's face it, offenders know that they're doing something wrong. That's why they do it in private. They don't do it in the middle of the picnic grounds on a Sunday afternoon where there's families and people all over the place abusing their kid right in the middle of, God and everybody. No, they do it in quiet where no one's going to see them because they know what they're doing is wrong. And so on some level, they feel some guilt about that. And children pick up on it. And even if the perpetrator doesn't say anything, they take that on. Oh, I'm party to this thing that shouldn't happen. I'm a bad person. So they take on that guilt and shame. Also, offenders will try to put it on them. Oh, you like this. You wanted this. And if you tell people, they're going to think you're gay or you're some kind of a pervert. I mean, all kinds of inducements to keep the client silent. So they feel a lot of guilt and shame. One of my students one time, my Swiss student, she said, guilt is about what you've done. Shame is about who you are. If I feel shameful, it's because I feel like I'm a bad person. If I feel guilty, I've done a bad thing. So first of all, it's interesting and valuable to differentiate what is the client feeling. Is the client feeling shame or guilt or both? Because you approach them differently. If it's about guilt, then you can focus on the behavior. You learn this behavior from your abusive caregiver, and they made it seem normal, but it's not, it's harmful. You're in here doing therapy, you often feel depressed, you felt suicidal not that long ago. This has been the impact of what you've experienced. So you are not a perpetrator. You have some shame, and you have some guilt about what happened, but it's not yours. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the perpetrator. They're the ones they're guilty of this crime, not you. They're the ones that should feel ashamed about what they've done to somebody, not you. But, one of my clients recently said the longest trip is from here to here and back again. From head to heart and back again. Because we can all intellectually say, oh, yes, the guilt and shame was the offenders, but that's not going to shift until you work through the feelings around that. It takes more time and energy to resolve it on an emotional level. Intellectually, they get it, but emotionally, it takes more work. So this is, because it's so common, it's something that we spend a lot of time working on with clients. Dissociation, I've mentioned that before. It's the opposite of association. Dissociation is not being connected, not being present, not being engaged in the life around you, whether it be work, school, interpersonal dynamics, whatever. When you're dissociated, you're not present. And sometimes our clients will do that. We'll be in a session and we realize that they've just glazed over. And they probably haven't heard a word I've said for the last 15 minutes. Or hour if I'm not paying attention. But dissociation, they get really good at it. During the abuse, they cannot bear to be in their body, so they leave. They go off into the painting, or they go out the window into the clouds. A therapist in Vancouver, who's quite well known, say that she would disappear into a crack in the wall. She was also a survivor. So dissociation is just disengaging from your present, both internal and external, and just being off in some kind of fantasy world. So of course you want them to associate, to reconnect, to try to figure out what that's all about, but more about that when we get into interventions. Distorted boundaries is the next issue. The very essence of abuse is that a boundary has been violated. If no boundary had been violated, no abuse would have taken place. So when someone has been, when their boundaries have been violated through sexual abuse, they don't really have a sense of boundaries, especially if it happened in the home. Now, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a home where we had pretty healthy boundaries. Now, we didn't sit around the dinner table at night talking about boundaries. We didn't never use that word, but it was something that we felt. If you're in the bathroom, you didn't have to lock the door. Nobody's going to come in because the door is locked. Because the door is closed, not locked. Worst case scenario, if you're in the shower, the door opens this far, a hand comes, just getting my hairbrush, the door closed because there was a counter right there with hairbrushes and whatnot. So maybe somebody would open the door and get their hairbrush, you know, and that would be it. They didn't actually come into the room. But in other homes, you do not dare close the door. If you close it, you're going to get in trouble. If you lock it, it gets kicked in because privacy is not allowed in some households. So I do a lot of work on boundaries, and I'll get to that when we talk more about interventions, but clients don't have boundaries. I've had clients that they'll just show up and they'll barge into my office. It doesn't matter whether I'm with the client or not, they'll just barge in. And I have to really curtail that and say, oh, no, you can't do that. First of all, you can't come in unless you have an appointment, and you can't come barging in. If you have an appointment, wait in the waiting room, I'll come find you when I'm ready. The same client, he would come in and he'd stick his finger in the plant, and he'd go around watering the plants. And I said, don't do that, because that's our responsibility to take care of it. Your job is to come here, sit down in the waiting room, come in when your session is called, do the work that you need to do, and then go home. But it took a lot of working to get him to respect boundaries. He would show up unannounced and expect me to drop everything and see him. I fell for that a time or two, but then I realized, no, he's still testing me. He's not showing up for sessions that I book, and he's showing up unannounced and wanting me to stop everything and see him, because if I really cared about him, I would set everything aside and be there for him. Or if he didn't show up, I'd say, oh, well, that's okay. I care so much about him that if he misses a session, it's okay. But I challenged him on it. I said, you're testing me. You need to know that I actually care about your well-being. So you miss appointments thinking if I don't drop you, then it must mean I care. And when you come barging in and I have to drop everything and be there with you, again, that reaffirms that you matter to me. I said, you do matter to me. I set aside an hour and a half a week that's your time. Nobody else gets it. I vigorously protect that time block because that belongs to you. That's when you need to come in, sit down with me, and we focus on what you need. But it really took a lot of work for him to embrace that. He's now talking to another therapist on staff who does EMDR. I've been trained in it, but I'm not very good at it. It's way too structured for me. But this other therapist is really good at it, and he's done some 3PO, EMDR with him, and it's been really helpful. He's not obsessed as much as he used to be. He no longer tests anymore. He has much better boundaries. He used to go barging into the victim services worker's office while he's waiting. And they have work to do too. They can't stop what they're doing and accommodate him. So
what's the EMDR?
EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. I'll talk about it more. It comes up at some point, so I'll explain more about it and how it works. You have to be officially trained in it and certified, or else you can't use it. I've been trained in it, but it doesn't fit my style, so I very rarely use it. Identity ambiguity, that comes partly from, it's kind of in the middle between two issues, because it's partly because of distorted boundaries. If you don't know where you are, if you don't know where your boundaries are, you don't know where you exist. Imagine if there was no boundary between the United States and Canada. Where does Canada end and the United States begin? Without a boundary, we have no way of knowing exactly. Is it that line or this? I don't know. Is it this side of the river or the other? I don't know. But because we have a boundary that's well established internationally, it's on maps all over the world, we know where Canada exists and where the United States exists. But in interpersonal dynamics, if those relationships aren't clearly articulated, the self is rather ambiguous. So with distorted boundaries, they have a distorted identity. And then I have that right ahead of sexual orientation, because all the things we talked about earlier, they don't know where they're at because they don't know where their sexual boundaries is. Is it okay for me to have sex with women? Is it okay for me to have sex with men? Is it okay for me to have sex with both? I don't know. I'm confused. When I was a kid, both adult men and women had sex with me. I don't know what's right. I don't know what am I supposed to do? I have no idea. So that aspect of identity is also confused and ambiguous because of the trauma that they experienced. Low self-esteem, your only value is if you accommodate my needs. Other than that, you're useless. That's the message they get. So low self-esteem is very common amongst offenders. Well, probably, but amongst survivors. I'm tired. So low self-esteem is really common. You know, remember I said that when I was going to university, my whole thing was working with gifted children? So one of the things that I really do is I try to listen for anything that I can validate my client's worth. And I'll talk more about that later when I get more into interventions. But anything that we can do to lift that self-esteem, the fact that we care about them, that we set aside our life for them, and especially in my agency where we don't make a big deal about money. If you can make it, if you qualify for compensation, great. We get our expenses covered and you don't have to pay. That makes us all happy. Sliding scale, $10. Okay, that's enough. That's fine. I'm here to help you do the work. If you can contribute $10, that's great. It's going to help us make sure that we can pay the rent, but it's not about that. It's about you being important to me. And when clients pick up on the sincerity of our true regard for our clients, we do. I've had clients that I find it very difficult to work with. They're quirky, or they're weird, or they're highly resistant, and they throw judgments around like confetti. You know, I still give them my best possible skill set. They may not have as much empathetic connection. I've got some clients that I really like, and if I met them in a social context, I think they would be great people to have as friends, but of course, they can't be both. But there are clients that it's easier for me to care about, but every client gets my absolute best set of skills and my attention because I've made a commitment to that, and they deserve it. Even if I can't feel all kind of warm and fuzzy, they deserve someone to give them the best that they have to give. And so that's what I do. And all of our staff do. We really do care about our clients. There's occasional clients that are very difficult, but we understand where that difficulty comes from. And we still care about them. Yes, they're cantankerous. Yes, they're difficult. Yes, they're highly critical when they're not even, the criticism is not even valid. But they're striking out, they're angry. They need someone to hear them be angry and say, you have a right to be angry. So, you know, they start with low self-esteem, and we do everything we can to build that self-esteem. They'll start taking better care of themselves if the self-esteem is lifted. When they have low self-esteem, they don't care about themselves. They don't take care of themselves. They don't sleep properly. They don't bathe. They don't eat properly. They hang out in dangerous, unhealthy environments with dangerous and unhealthy people because they don't believe they deserve any better. So it's really challenging when someone is low self-esteem is putting them in constant danger. Poor concentration, that's, again, it kind of circles back to dissociation. In school, because kids are dissociated, they can't concentrate. They're off somewhere. They're disengaged because if they stay connected, then they might get flashbacks. They might be getting memories, and they can't let any of that stuff show. Or maybe they are struggling to keep it hidden, whatever. But very often, poor concentration is a big issue for survivors. And so they don't do well in school. They end up flunking out of school, deciding, I can't even make it out of grade 12, so why would I even think about college? I don't know. So, and I wouldn't say that's across the board because if your addiction is academic performance, and there are survivors that bury themselves in their studies. They are constantly studying. They're rewriting that essay 4 times to make sure it's right. Their obsession is about their academic career. And so they do well in school, but not all. Some have really poor concentration, and it gets very much in the way. Flat affect is just flat emotion. And that comes from 2 places. One, that the emotions are so overwhelming that they just can't connect it with them. if I connect with my feelings, I'm going to end up killing myself. So I'm not going to deal with that. I'm just not going to feel anything. It's easier to be numb. So they shut down. Also, they were not allowed to have their feelings. They're offenders. Don't you get angry with me. You know, it's not okay to be upset. You can't tell anybody about this. You know, all kinds of things. So the best way for them to survive an emotional chaos is to not have feelings, to shut them all down. And you see people that, like I mentioned, the guy telling me the story about being abused, and I had the tear on my cheek. The only way that he could survive in life was to be numbed out. Here he was telling me a horrible story. Did I tell you the details about what happened, the priest and the mom? And no? He was forced to have intercourse with his mother while being sodomized by the parish priest. And the only way that he could cope with that is to not be present in his body, to leave, and to not have any kind of emotional reaction to a really horrendous, overwhelming experience. And he said to me one day, he said, I have no sensation in my body. Any sexual experience, whether it's myself or with somebody, I basically don't have it. It takes me forever to have an orgasm, or maybe not at all. It's like my body's wrapped in cotton. I just don't feel anything. And I said, well, the only way that you could cope with an overwhelming experience was to not be present in your body. So anytime that sexual energy starts happening, by association, your body's well-tuned, well-trained to just disconnect, not be present. And he said, well, is that possible? I said, it would make sense to me. That's how you survive the abuse. So you've trained your body not to be connected in any kind of sexual situation. So he said, oh, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. He went away. The next week he came back and he said, I ride my bike, and up until last week, I would feel kind of hot and sweaty and out of breath, but that was it. But this week, I can feel the exertion in my legs. I'm getting my body back. He was so excited because for the first time in so long, he was actually being able to experience being in his body. And before then, he felt wet from the sweat and out of breath. That was it. So he wasn't in therapy a long time after that. So he never had an opportunity to share with me how it might have been to be in a relationship and to be intimate with somebody. But I'm hoping that he was able to reclaim his ability to be intimate and his sexuality. But at that time, he was just so numbed out, physically, emotionally, just flat. So it takes sometimes a lot of work for people to be fully engaged with themselves on a psychological, emotional, physical level. Very often when people dissociate, they're not in their body even. So sometimes we'll ask people, what are you aware of in your body? Oh, I don't know. Well, just sort of close your eyes, focus, see what you feel. Okay, I've got some tension in my neck, and my stomach's kind of knotted up. Well, then they start getting reconnected with what is going on that results in the body reacting in that way. If I'm walking by a dog that's barking at me, my whole body's going to tense up because that dog is going to bite me, hump my leg, or lick my face, and I'm not interested in any of that. So, I'm going to tense up because I really don't like dogs. So when you're in danger or some kind of perceived danger, you get all tensed up. And, so being in your body doesn't even feel good. So it's not just being emotionally flat, but being disengaged psychologically, emotionally, physically. So, what's our time like today?
It's presently 2:45. Do you want to take a 15-minute break?
Yeah, let's take a break and then we'll come back to this cell. I'm going to put the last one on. So
We'll return at approximately 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time.
Okay.